I've added a special panel immediately after our lunch in BW 390. It's a short panel featuring two of our students, Angin and Elena. You guys can stand up for a minute so people can see you. And I call this panel, yeah, thank you. Angin grew up in Artsakh and is an LLM student. Elena she grew up in Moldova. She's going to talk about Transnistria. And she's also the editor-in-chief of the Southwestern Law Review. I'm thrilled. I call this this panel the first-person panel because they're going to talk about their experiences just for a few minutes. It's a warm-up to our third and final panel today, and it's an incentive also for you not to dilly-dally too much before getting back to BW 390 for the afternoon. So with that said, I'm going to do a very simple introduction of our keynote speaker, since you've already met him. In fact, I'm going to introduce him like he's a musical guest on Saturday Night Live. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Andrei Richter.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the hospitality, which is so much influenced by Armenian flavor. And I come from Vienna, Austria, where we don't have a single good Armenian restaurant, and we have 3 mediocre Georgian restaurants, and not a single one Armenian. And I'm glad I was glad last night to have very good Armenian food, and that's one of the elements of what I appreciate a lot. I will talk. It's a keynote, which is basically at the end of the whole event. So it's not so much a keynote; it's more like intermission in a way. And but I would like to start with a question which was raised by the gentleman whom I recognized at the latest panel, who said, "Would we discuss the issue if not the Ukrainian crisis and the Ukrainian war today?" And when Michael suggested that I do the keynote on a particular topic of Nagorno-Karabakh, I almost immediately remembered that quite a number of years ago, when I published a textbook on online media, that was 2012, I believe, as conclusion, I wrote about the case on which I'm going to talk today. And the case, although it relates to Karabakh coverage, the case is emblematic of post-Soviet media regulation and post-Soviet media policies. And when I refresh my memory 10 years later on the case, I realized that it has a lot to do with US, with Iran, with, of course, Karabakh, Armenia, Azerbaijan. So I thought it's a perfect topic for the keynote presentation. Many of you probably have heard or read about the case, but others probably not, and I would like to talk about it. To begin, first of all, let me say again that the collapse of the Soviet Union was not as peaceful as we might remember in our collective memories, at least not you, but those in the northern part of the Soviet Union. It was not definitely peaceful. There were several wars, there were plenty of casualties, there was a lot of life, a lot of home in the physical sense, a lot of loss of jobs and everything related. And just to give a few figures, the civil war in Tajikistan in 1992-1997 has led to 157,000 people being killed, civilians, 37,000 households completely destroyed, about 600,000 people who fled to Afghanistan in the 90s, and 200,000 Tajiks being dispersed in other parts of the Soviet Union. A tremendous tragedy, I believe. The number of civilians who were killed in the first Chechen War in 94-96 is estimated to be 30,000 people. I'm sorry, 50,000 people. And the conflict led eventually to some 260,000 persons displaced. And Nagorno-Karabakh, of course, was the first major conflict that started in February 1988 on the eve of the USSR collapse and continues today. And it has been the longest, and even more, there is no end to this conflict in sight. The conservative estimates of the total number of civilians and the battle casualties of the Karabakh War speak about 55,000 lives lost in total in the period of 88-96, so in the first stage of the Karabakh War. And over 1 million people were displaced as a result of the conflict. So we are talking about huge tragedies, huge conflicts. And the latest conflict, the war in Ukraine, is definitely also one of the elements of the legacy of what started to happen with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's not that I miss the collapse of the Soviet Union, and although Putin once said that this collapse was the biggest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century, I disagree, because it was not a geopolitical tragedy. It was a tragedy for many millions of the Soviets because of these conflicts in particular. The case which I want to describe is the case of Fatullayev, and eventually it resulted in the quite famous case of the European Court of Human Rights of Fatullayev versus Azerbaijan. Although I will speak about Azeri journalist and his trials and tribulations, it has much to do with Karabakh and relevant things. So Fatullayev, at the time of what I'm going to describe, was a young, popular Azerbaijani journalist who was editor of several publications. The most popular of those was Realny Azerbaijan, or I would translate it into English as Real Life Azerbaijan, a weekly newspaper published in Baku. And he published stories typically very critical of the authorities of Azerbaijan. He had faced at the time a number of lawsuits, civil lawsuits on defamation from the members of the parliament and ministers of the government, as well as several cases related to criminal defamation, which stays in Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan is, I will try to sort of step away to put it into wider post-Soviet context. Azerbaijan is one of the 8 out of 15 post-Soviet countries which keeps criminal defamation in the books and implements criminal defamation. And despite a number of promises to decriminalize defamation and even national human rights program that was signed by President Aliyev in 2011, as of today, it is firmly in place. There are cases, there are imprisoned journalists because of what they write. Prehistory, as a result of one of such criminal cases, Fatullayev was found guilty in 2006 and sentenced to 2.5 years of suspended sentence for defamation, suspended imprisonment. He received a lot of death threats. His father was, for example, kidnapped, and the condition for ransom was that he closes his publication, Realny Azerbaijan. He closed the publication, the father was released, and then he opened it again. So it's a difficult human story of a journalist in Azerbaijan as well. Shortly before the real problem started, in 2005, Fatullayev traveled as a journalist to Nagorno-Karabakh, or Artsakh, as most of you would say. And it was quite a rare case of travel of journalists across the borders between Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh, or even Armenia and Azerbaijan. At that time, it still is today. And therefore, his travel and his impressions and his interviews that he did during the trip were definitely of quite big interest in the country. He published a story of his travel titled Karabakh Diary in several issues of his newspaper, and that was in the end of 2006 and beginning of 2007. And one of the points, the most controversial point of Karabakh Diary, of these stories, was his interview and rendering of the interview that in the conversations with the locals in Karabakh, Armenian officials, including Armenian-speaking officials, he got confirmation of the stories that he heard before related to the probably most important part of Karabakh War, the so-called Khadjali events in the beginning of the war. And he wrote in Karabakh Diary that he got confirmation from the local officials in Karabakh that the story is not as plain as it might be presented by the Azeri official history. And the official history of Azerbaijan, supported by Azeri law, meaning the decree of President Heydar Aliyev of 1994, that what happened there is considered to be as a genocide by Armenians of the peaceful Azeri population. According to the official history, on that day, Armenian armed formations, with the help of the Soviet army, and that was very beginning of 1992, the Soviet army was still in place, although there was no Soviet Union in the beginning of 1992. Together, they killed hundreds of civilians from among the inhabitants of Khadjali. What he wrote in, what Fatullayev wrote in Karabakh Diary was that the defenders of Khadjali, the Azeri defenders of Khadjali, first of all, they knew about the imminent attack of the Armenian forces. The Armenian forces warned the civilians through loudspeakers that there will be an attack. They provided a safe corridor along the Karkar River. And those who left Khadjali through Karkar River safe corridor, they were untouched. On the other hand, he wrote some of the PFA, People's Front of Azerbaijan battalions, soldiers, they left their positions in Khadjali, threw away the arms, joined the refugees from Khadjali, the Azeri refugees from Khadjali, and led them not along the safe corridor, but in the direction of an Armenian village, where they came under fire and many were killed. What he also wrote that he believed that the aim of Azeri battalions was not so much saving civilian population of Khadjali, but rather a plan to assist in the plan to overthrow Azeri President Ayaz Mutalibov at that time, and to shed more blood in order to aggravate the conflict between Karabakh and Armenia. I'm sorry, Karabakh and Azerbaijan. Then, some months later, about a year later, comes the second part of the story, which can be called Comments on Azeri Tricolor website. That's a website which allowed for readers to exchange views. And as I said, sometime later after the publication of the Karabakh Diary, somebody who named himself Einullah Fatullayev, he wrote comments on the web page in reply to some of the questions of the readers of his articles. And in particular, he wrote, I visited this town, Naftalan, where he met the refugees, where I spoke with hundreds, I repeat, hundreds of refugees who insisted that the safe corridor existed and that they survived thanks to this corridor. You see, that was a war and a front line. Of course, the Armenians killed civilians, but our troops shot at some of the inhabitants of Khajali, Azeri inhabitants of Khajali. Whether this was done intentionally or not, the investigators will have to find out. They were killed not by some mysterious shooters, but by provocateurs from the PFA battalions. The bodies were mutilated by our own troops. So that was met with a huge uproar in Azeri media, from among the Azeri public, and almost immediately came a civil defamation lawsuit by the head of an NGO in Azerbaijan, which said that both the comments in Azeri Tricolor and the articles in Karabakh Diary, they were discrediting the relatives of the victims of the tragedy, veterans, soldiers of the National Army of Azerbaijan, and entire Azerbaijani people. The court decision was to publish a refutation and to pay 17,000 euro as compensation of moral damages. A bit later after the verdict, after the decision of the court, a criminal case was opened on request of some of the former soldiers of Azerbaijani army, saying that they were defamed. It was a private criminal procedure, and the case was reviewed by the same court and the same judge who made a decision on the civil case, but now it was a criminal case. And Fatullayev was found guilty of criminal defamation aggravated by the accusations of individuals of a grave or extremely grievous offense, and sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. Real prison, this time, not suspended sentencing. And one of the arguments, of course, of the prosecution was that the story by Fatullayev was contrary to protected by law history of the country. And the place of war in the history of post-Soviet countries, a war, let's put it like this, a war in the history of post-Soviet countries occupies a very important position in most cases, I would say. While in the Soviet times, the protection of World War II history was enabled by the total censorship, by the system of education, and even there it started only probably in the mid-60s. After the war, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a number of laws and decrees were adopted in some of the countries of the former Soviet Union in relation to their particular wars and to the possibility to defame the role of the state in those wars. And the most important probably is the most recent amendments to the Russian laws, which not only punish criminally for false information about the activity of the Russian army, but also, for example, it provides liability for speaking in public, including in the media, including online, identifying the goals, decisions, and actions of the leadership of the USSR. That's, again, it's the new law. And the goals, decisions, and actions of the leadership of the Nazi Germany and the Axis. And that is a criminal liability as well. Second chapter. Sorry, do I take a lot of time, Mike? Do you have another 10 minutes?
You have another 5.
Okay. Okay. The second chapter is less related to Karabakh, but still is quite interesting. It's an article published by Fatullayev, The Leaves Go to War, which he published quite several weeks before he got into prison. The Leaves Go to War was an article about Aliyev government supporting US in the attacks of US against Iran, aggressive policies of US against Iran. According to the article, the US forces Azeri government to also attack Iran and to be on the side of Americans in the possible war between US and Iran. And Fatullayev wrote in the article, that's wrong, we should stay neutral, because otherwise Iranian Air Force will strike targets in Azerbaijan, including governmental offices, business centers, oil fields, etc. A group of foreign companies' workers filed a request to the Ministry of National Security to open a criminal case, which was opened on the grounds of incitement to terrorism. I will not go into detail, but Fatullayev got for that crime, already being in prison, he got 8.5 years imprisonment, in addition to the 2.5 that he was already serving. Then it goes to the European Court of Human Rights, which reviewed the case and noted, of course, that the public discussion on the role and responsibility of the Azeri authorities for the failure to prevent or provoke Hadjali events was a legitimate right of a journalist to present, and was completely in line with the European values of freedom of expression, and Azerbaijan is a member of Council of Europe. And also, the court rejected the possibility that that was suggested by Azeri authorities in the European Court, that existing doubts on what happened in Hadjali should be compared with the genocide of Jews during World War II by saying they are completely unrelated sets of events. By the way, none of the post-Soviet countries has a provision or norm in the law which would establish liability for Holocaust denial. Still, Azerbaijan took Holocaust denial provisions in order to strengthen their line in the European Court. So finally, European Court makes a decision that Fatullayev should be freed immediately. The court said he might not be professionally perfect as a journalist because he didn't provide proof for what he was saying, but it has nothing to do with criminal liability. He should be freed immediately. That was April 2010. He is not freed. He is not freed. There is a long procedure. Azerbaijan appeals to the Grand Chamber of the European Court. Grand Chamber confirms the decision. Then Azerbaijan goes, discusses the matter in the Supreme Court of Azerbaijan. The decision in November of 2010 says, yes, okay, let's free him. But in the meantime, Fatullayev is accused, being in prison all the time, is accused of possession of drugs, heroin, in a Baku prison. Another 2 years. Another 2 years were added to his term. And Azerbaijan said, okay, we recognize the decision of the European Court, but he's a drug smuggler, so he will stay, despite all the demands. So what happened in late May of next year, 2011, the current President Aliyev pardoned Fatullayev as a gesture and among dozens of other criminals as a gesture before the Independence Day of Azerbaijan, and he was freed. Many thought that he would flee the country. He didn't. And here comes another turn of events. Fatullayev, who stays until now in Azerbaijan, becomes a very loyal journalist to the authorities. He establishes several new media outlets which praise Aliyev government, which attack Germany in particular on violations of human rights, which attacks international human rights organizations which fought for his liberation for being insincere. He traveled recently to Ukraine and Moldova, and he was very critical of the Russian aggression, completely in line with the Azeri logic that what happens in Transnistria and Eastern Ukraine is very much similar to what happens in Karabakh. He even went to Karabakh in summer of last year, in August of last year, and reported from there that things are completely going in favor of Azerbaijan, and the territory will be, as he wrote, liberated by Azerbaijan very soon. That's very sad to an otherwise pathetic story, and my short conclusions, I would make just 4 points. First of all, the authoritarian regimes in the post-Soviet area are capable and willing to attack critical journalists and the media with all force available. That's absolutely clear. But what is also clear, that is not enough. Attacking journalists, closing media outlets today is not enough for the authoritarian authorities. It is very important for them to be in the media, to be in the social media as well. And therefore, corrupting journalists, corrupting media is as important as attacking those who don't want to be corrupted, for example. International organizations are not strong, but they still are capable to do things, especially if the country is a participant of the Council of Europe, like in the case of Fatullayev. And recent conflicts and the pandemic, by the way, raise another quite important, in my personal view, worries about the issue of how national security and public health are abused as a reason for the governments to control information and to establish, I believe, by the end of the day, a governmental monopoly on information, when everything which was not said by the government is forbidden, and only information that comes from the government or from the sources controlled by the government is legal. Thank you very much.
So we're going to reconvene in BW 390. You will have a chance to talk with Dr. Richter after the proceedings today, because we're really fortunate to have David McFadden, our senior librarian. David, why don't you stand up, who is an expert on this beautiful building. Some of you may be wondering about the history of this delightful Art Deco building. He, along with Dean Robert Minnitt, you can stand up too, Dean Mena is our logistical specialist. He keeps the trains running, so to speak. The two of them are going to be given great access to the building, including areas that are generally not open to the public. So immediately after the last panel, we're going to go on that, and that's a great opportunity as you are roaming the building with our speakers to ask them informal one-on-one questions, and I think you'd be amenable to that, right, Dr. Richter? Okay, that would be terrific. So we are, you guys can finish up, but if you hurry down to BW 390, you'll get to hear first-person panel, the first-person panel with Angin and Elena. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of the lunch. Thanks.